Aliupa. I don't know what that meant, if it means anything, but this is how did Russia become an empire? Certainly wasn't by what I just said. We're just going to do this one little part here because it's about 13 minutes. Okay, video. Oh yeah, imagine I said something very important right now. Oh, it's very enlightening, Kris. Thank you. You're welcome.
Peter used this opportunity to cross the river and set up camp north of Poltava. The camp was fortified afterwards, and a series of redoubts were built. To the rear, the Russian position was protected by the river and marshland. There was no chance of the Swedes mounting any flanking maneuvers.
I have a question. Was Peter the First, was he a decent leader? Militarily? Or other? I saw the history of Russia. I remember the name. I just don't remember.
The Swedish army numbered around 22,000 men, with a similar amount of cavalry and infantry. They also had around 30 guns. However, the artillery was not used during the battle, since Charles anticipated a quick breakthrough. There were also around 3,000 of Mazeppa's Cossacks and 1,000 Poles on the Swedish side. The Russian army had in total around 80,000 men, with over 30,000 infantry, around 20,000 horsemen, and 23 to 25,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks. The Russians also had over 100 guns. The numbers and the positions of the armies remind us of the Battle of Narva. Nevertheless, there are two important differences here. The Swedish army wasn't led by its best commander, and the Russian army had been transformed from a peasant mob into a credible fighting machine.
They're slowly building up to being a force.
The Swedish War Council debated on whether they should use a cautious or aggressive plan of attack. The more senior commanders in the army preferred a steady offensive, while the younger ones proposed an all-out attack. In the end, the king chose to heed the advice to strike the iron while it's hot. Unable to take part in the battle himself, Charles devised a battle plan and entrusted it to Field Marshal Rienschold. What Charles did not know was that the Field Marshal was on bad terms with most of the other generals. On account of that, he failed to relay the plans properly to them, dealing a significant blow to the organization and cohesion of the army before the battle even started.
Yep.
Preparations for the battle started on the 9th of July 7th. The Swedes left 2,500 men to guard the baggage train and camp, 2,000 in front of Poltava to prevent a breakout, and another 1,500 to check the Cossacks and Kalmyks.
What is with this? I don't know if this is a defensive line or if this is an attacking line, or if this is anything. Maybe. Like, what is this? I don't know.
A crucial part of Charles's plan was the element of surprise, so the army started preparing to attack at night. The lack of organization became evident here, as the cavalry took too long to form up and the summer night was quite short. By the time...
Are those guns? So you got 3 guns firing ahead, you got taking out the side, taking out the side, taking out the side, and taking out the side and firing straight ahead. Okay. I've never seen this military alignment like this. Is this something that was common? Or something that they were just trying? Like, I've never seen it like this.
The Swedes were ready to attack, the Russians were already alert. At 4 a.m.
And I apologize. This looks like a flashlight with the light on because it seems like it's at night. They all have flashlights. Sorry. It's making me chuckle.
General Rus started the Swedish offensive by trying to envelop the first frontal redoubts. The Swedes attacked relentlessly and took the first 2, but they were unable to advance further. Russian artillery devastated the assaulting soldiers, and they did not have enough men left to attack the remaining redoubts. The Russian commanders still feared the Swedish troops, and asked Peter to send the infantry from his camp to aid the defenders at the redoubts. Peter decided to not make any unnecessary moves, since he knew that the Swedes were suffering heavy casualties and that it would only be a matter of time before they lost steam. While this was happening, Löwenhaupt and Rienschuld drove back the main body of the Russian army behind the redoubts. However, they did not coordinate their attacks well enough and were split up. Charles, watching the battle from afar, ordered both Rus and Löwenhaupt to reconnect with the main body of the army outside of the Russian camp. Rus had lost most of his men already and decided to retreat to a redoubt by the river, where he later surrendered. Löwenhaupt, after several hours of inconclusive fighting, led his 2,400 men through intense artillery fire to Rienschuld's force. With what was left of the Swedish army united, they began advancing towards the main Russian force. It was at this point that Peter ordered the gates of the camp to be opened and 30,000 of his infantry to array in battle lines. The cavalry subsequently formed up at the flanks. The Swedish commanders, seeing that the Russian line was significantly wider than their own, stretched the Karolians thin in an effort to avoid envelopment. While they were approaching the Russian army, Peter's artillery devastated the Swedish forces. Fearless in the face of death, the elite Swedish infantry approached until they could see the white in their enemies' eyes and unleashed several musket volleys. What was supposed to be their deadliest weapon came to be almost useless. The winter cold and bad weather in the last year reduced the quality of their gunpowder, and most of the shots did not even reach the Russians.
Wow.
The Russian volleys, in contrast, killed many Swedes. Starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered, the entire Swedish army charged. The few units which made it to the Russian lines fought bravely before being killed. Sources tell that only the company led by Count Torstensson, grandson of the famous Lennart Torstensson, managed to penetrate the Russian lines before being enveloped and massacred together with their leader. As the defeated Swedes retreated from the battlefield, the Russian cavalry pursued them and cut down many. Meanwhile, Charles, after having his bodyguards killed by a cannonball, gathered what was left of his army and retreated south. In the end, the Swedes lost around 7,000 men, with a further 2,700 captured, including Rienschuld and other top commanders. The Russians had 1,300 men killed and another 3,300 injured. Constantly pursued by the Russian army under Menshikov, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire with 1,000 of his men. The rest of his army, in the hands of Löwenhaupt, surrendered to the Russians at Perevalojna 3 days after the battle. The captured commanders were kept as Peter's prisoners, while the soldiers that caused Peter so much trouble were settled in Siberia. For Sweden, the Battle of Poltava was a catastrophic defeat. Its elite continental army was annihilated, grievously reducing its defensive capabilities. Peter called his great victory at Poltava a divine miracle, as he finally managed to defeat the most formidable army in Europe. Russian armies would now be free to encroach into Poland and the Baltic without any resistance. Following nearly a decade of Swedish domination in the Great Northern War, Russia would now gain the upper hand. Peter left Poltava for Kiev shortly after the surrender of the Swedish army at Perevalojna. Once there, he sent letters throughout the continent describing the details of the battle and his complete victory. Europe was left in complete shock. Until that moment, they had only received news of continuous Swedish victories. The Duke of Marlborough famously wrote, "We have no confirmation as yet of the battle between the Swedes and the Muscovites, but should it be true of the first being so entirely beaten as is reported, what a melancholy reflection it is that after constant success for 10 years, Charles XII should in 2 hours' mismanagement and ill success ruin himself and his country." The rest of Europe's elite had a similar disposition towards the Russian victory. However, some welcomed Russia onto the European stage. The famous polymath and philosopher Leibniz remarked that Peter would now be the Turk of the North. Charles himself only avoided capture by sacrificing the majority of his elite army and his most trusted commanders. Though Russian forces pursued the Swedish king, They could not catch him before he crossed the Bug and entered Ottoman territory. Sultan Ahmed III prepared a camp for Charles and his followers at Bender, and they would settle there for the time being. Peter was elated because of his grand victory, yet he was also equally disappointed due to Charles and Mazeppa's escape into Ottoman lands. Wasting no time, the Tsar entered diplomatic talks with Augustus of Saxony, Frederick of Denmark, Frederick William of Prussia, and George I of Hanover. The victorious Russian army was subsequently split in two. Sheremetev would move north towards the Baltic, while Menshikov would advance west into Poland. Stanisław, whose position in Poland was already negligible, saw his royal authority erode completely after the defeat of the Karolian army. Augustus repudiated the Treaty of Altenstadt and advanced into Poland with an army. The magnates of the Commonwealth, either out of dislike towards Stanisław or fear of Russian aggression, began endearing themselves to their former monarch and offered him the crown once again. Left without any alternative, Stanisław joined the Swedish forces in their retreat to Pomerania and then abdicated. To compensate him for the lost crown, Charles granted him the Principality of Zweibrücken and named him Count Palatine. King once again, Augustus met Peter on the 9th of October at Turin. He feared Peter's reaction to having been abandoned in 1706. However, the Tsar did not hold a grudge. Nevertheless, at dinner, Peter could not resist an ironic thrust at Augustus's faithlessness. "I always wear the cutlass you gave me," Peter said, "but it seems you do not care for the sword I gave you, as I see you are not wearing it." Augustus replied that he prized Peter's gift, but that somehow in the haste of his departure from Dresden, he had left it behind. "Ah," said Peter, "then let me give you another." He gave Augustus the same sword he had given him before, which had been discovered in Charles's baggage at Poltava. The monarchs signed a new treaty that effectively made the Commonwealth a Russian dependency in all but name.
To the Polish throne. Grants an army to fight the rebels that against the rule. Okay. It took a second to understand what I read. Russian troops to station in Poland as the... What is that? It's not guarantor, right? I can say I don't think I've ever seen that word before. It recognizes him. All right.
The Russians were allowed to station their troops in the Commonwealth. Peter would become the guarantor of the rights of the Polish nobility, while Augustus would join all of Peter's wars. One secret clause of the treaty was that Augustus would be allowed to claim Livonia. In the following days, Peter also established alliances with the Prussians and the Danes, who would enter the war again by October 1709. Although the Danish king was eager to enter the war and conquer, he did not take into account the readiness of his army. The best Danish soldiers were away, fighting in the Spanish Wars of Succession under the Duke of Marlborough. The 14,000 men that landed near Helsingborg at the end of November were inexperienced, badly supplied, and poorly equipped. The commander-in-chief of the Danish army, Christian Dietzlau Reyentlauw, wanted to advance quickly on the rest of Scania. The poor state of his army prevented him from doing so, and he only started moving from Helsingborg in January. Following the capture of Kristianstad, Landskrona and Malmö were besieged. Hearing of the Danish invasion, the general, Magnus Stenbock, started assembling an army at Växjö. Due to the fact that his army consisted mostly of recruits, he was hesitant to march against the Danes. Fortunately for him, the Norwegians could not organize their army at the time, and did not even launch a single raid across the border. This freed up several veteran regiments that were guarding the Norwegian border to join his army. On February 22, 1710, Stenbock started advancing towards Scania with a large force. Rentlao's initial plan was to capture some smaller settlements between Malmo and Landskrona in order to gather supplies from the people there, and afterwards set up a strong defensive position to await Stenbock. The lack of supplies and winter clothing, however, took a severe toll on the Danish army. Disease spread through their ranks, and even Rentlau fell gravely ill. His replacement, Rantzau, proved far less capable. Rantzau abandoned his position in the south of Scania and moved back towards Helsingborg. Stenbock did not actively look for a big confrontation at the time, as he wanted to train his soldiers.
I'm going to end this here before we get any further, but I will come back with, let's see, 145. I'll knock out those two next when I do them, which I won't be actually doing them physically next. But you understand what I'm saying. Okay, we're going to end this here. This is where we're going to end it. When it ends, it's going to be right here, at this spot where it ended. And it ended at this spot right here. So the spot we're at is currently where it ended. It at the spot with the